Oh, well, look.
So much for that idea.
We're actually going to have to do this now. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Dramatic Interaction Masterclass here at the Kraken. For the purpose of YouTube, I am Robin D. Laws, a writer and game designer. I'm on the podcast Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff. And among my many credits includes a game called Hillfolk, which operates on a system called Drama System, and that's all about interpersonal interaction between characters, particularly between player characters. And Kat Tobin is the managing director of Pelgrane Press, which publishes Hillfolk. And it's one of your favorite things you run at conventions.
It is.
When they trick you into running things at conventions.
When they trick me into running things at conventions, which I try to avoid wherever possible. Hillfolk is generally my go-to game.
So what we want to talk about today are ways to sharpen characterization and interaction between characters. And the things like others of my games is that the great thing about Drama System is you can play it straight up, or you can steal its core ideas and put them in your own games. And in fact, after running Drama System for a while with my own group, who I think between various campaigns of Drama System have played it more than anyone in the world, once we play other games and they start disagreeing, they say, can't we just Drama System it? Just as when we do other investigative games where there's a mystery that shows up, can't we just gumshoe it? So the core idea behind a dramatic scene is that I guess let's talk about how it doesn't go well in other games first.
Okay, sure.
So traditionally, when you have a dispute between player characters in a typical role-playing game, let's say we're talking D&D, the thief says, let's go around the back and backstab them, and the paladin says, no. And then the thief says, but I really want to do that. And then the paladin says, I really don't want to do that. And the thief says, but I'm a thief. And the paladin says, but I'm a paladin.
Yeah.
And that's as far as it goes, and you're stuck. And of course, the amazing thing about that is that's actually the archetypal first character interaction that anybody has in role-playing, or at least in the world where people started with D&D, which many of us did. And now we're in a new era where many people are starting with D&D, but perhaps they're getting a little better sense of how to interact together since they're learning it from streaming. And although they don't use Drama System per se, there's a lot more character interaction in that. So what can we do to create a structure that allows characters to give in about half the time at least, although still giving them the right to stand their ground when something really matters. And so the first question is, how does this work in other media in which people interact with each other? And typically there's a petitioner, someone who wants something, and something often emotional, not just practical, from the other person. And then there is the grantor, the person who decides whether or not to grant that petition. And so Kat and I are going to start out with a little sample scene.
Okay.
You know the drill by now.
I know. I love it when you do this.
It's
the best.
Characters with strong relationships to one another are the ones that make the most fruitful scenes because they care about each other. So does someone want to come up with a relationship that my character and Kat's character might have that implies that we care about each other in some way?
One of you is a stepchild of the other.
Okay, so I'm the stepchild. Okay, so the other key to an exciting dramatic interaction is that the person who wants something from the other, they have a strong desire, and that desire is an emotional concession as well as a practical concession. So, for example, if you're so what emotionally does stepmom want from me? What might you think that you might want from your stepson?
I think that I might want, let's say, something like obedience or kind of that kind of respect that they're showing the other partner.
So often it's you have to kind of work in a scene and drama system to figure out why the other person might resist this thing, because a scene in which when stepmom comes to me and says, well, I think it's time you did more of the work around here. And I go, yep, you're right.
Yeah.
I've been thinking of doing that. Now that you mention
That's
it.
not very dramatic.
That's not very dramatic. And often it's a struggle sometimes to figure out why you would resist. But I think implicit in this first situation of stepmom wanting obedience from the son, we know why the son is going to offer resistance, why they're going to block that desire. So the petitioner typically begins the scene by coming at the grantor with some dialogue of some kind.
Right. Billy, why is your room such a mess?
Because I'm a modern child living in the modern world, and I have all sorts of important things that I need to do, and my room in Minecraft, I'll have you know, is perfectly clean.
Billy, you're 9. I've told you before, there are boundaries and there are rules in this house. And while I'm here, you're going to have to live by my rules.
While you're here.
Now, Billy, just because your father's had other wives does not mean he's going to have other wives after me. I'm the last. I'm here now. I'm permanent. I'm staying.
That's why I think of you. My nickname for you is 4.
Now, that's not a very nice thing to say. I'm here right now, and we're going to have to work together to keep this house tidy. You're part of this family as much as I am.
But this is my room. This is my domain where I am king, and I have authority, even though I lack authority in all other areas, except in my bigger kingdom in Minecraft.
I know it can be hard when you're young to understand why adults ask you to do the things that they ask you.
So what did you say to your 4th stepmom when she asked you to clean up her room, your room?
Well, I said, well, this is my domain, and I would much prefer to be a big nasty slob than to be a respectable member of society.
Well, then you get where I'm coming from.
I do. And now look at me. I'm the 4th wife of a guy who's clearly going to replace me in 2 wives' time. Is that where you want to be in your life, Billy? Because if not, maybe you could tidy your room. Have a different life. Make better choices than me, Billy.
I feel like I've been outmaneuvered. Okay, so how about if I just start by cleaning up this front half here with the books? What if I put the books away and the crisp wrappers, but I leave all the Lego blocks out? How about that?
If we can throw in the underwear as well, then we've got.
Oh, you said underwear. Oh. Okay. So there's a structure of a scene where there's, and in this case, the grantor finally did grant the petition. They came, offered a deal, came some way toward giving in, but also didn't concede 100%. And often that's an issue that people have when they are playing an interactive scene as people who perhaps are stubborn in real life sometimes want to not give in to other petitions, and also people who are asking for things sometimes expect to get everything they wanted and get complete yes.
All the control. All the control.
And that was a wonderful dynamic in the first Hillfolk game that I played. There was one the guy who played the chieftain always wanted a bigger concession than he got, and it really burned him that he wasn't fully getting it, much to the amusement of the whole rest of the group. There might have been some bleed in that situation. So the way that this is handled in drama system is there's a token economy where if the petitioner gets what they want, the petitioner gives the grantor a drama token. And if the petitioner doesn't have a drama token, as happens in the start of play, the token comes from the kitty. However, if on the other hand, I had just dug in my heels and completely refused and shut out stepmom completely and just, no way, you would have been thwarted in your aim, but you would have gotten the drama token. And the way the game works is that if you have 2 drama tokens, however, you are obligated, assuming you've bought into the premise of the game, when someone slides 2 drama tokens your way, you have to concede to some extent. You have to give in. Or if I have 3 drama tokens, I can block that forced concession by sliding those 3 drama tokens to the person, who then has enormous power in the game.
Next scene.
Just very briefly, the way the structure of the game works, there's you call scenes in order around the table, so that after you've called the scene where you go and talk to Billy, then if I was the next player in the line, I might go to Dad to sort of subtly narc on Mom and pull back from that. And so all of the players around the table are looking to see who's got all the tokens, because that gives them more power in the narrative. And the power can come out in a couple of ways. So it's very interesting. There's a difference of group culture between various groups, because in some groups it is just considered not on at all to force anyone to do anything, which sort of goes against the spirit of the game. But if it's working for them, if they can make it work without ever doing that, that also is fine. Some groups, however, sometimes in my group, look at the pile of tokens as just a visual object of prestige. So it's like a badge that you've won, and you're like any resource, they're reluctant to give them up. But when things really start to fly, when things really matter, then like at the climactic final session of a game, they tend to get exchanged pretty quickly and radically. So when you have run, now you have a broad experience in story games and LARPs, and how would you describe the experience of drama in role-playing in other contexts?
Well, I think that drama is ultimately, as you know and have said, what makes stories interesting. That's why we're drawn to stories. That's why narrative is so powerful. And I think that the way role-playing creates and engages us in stories is particularly powerful and particularly engaging. Drama in tabletop games is quite similar to drama in LARPs, but drama in LARPs is even more accentuated, because you're physically enacting everything. So instead of just kind of sitting there talking, you're entirely embodied in your character, and I think that adds a kind of an extra dimension to the physicality of it. Kind of really engages you in the environment and engages you in the story in a way that you aren't quite in tabletop. And the fact that you're moving around, that you can walk back and forth, that you can use, as well as just using your voice, kind of doing accents or doing tone of voice and things like that, like we would at a table. You can use your stance, you can use your pacing, you can use your movement to bring more drama. Because when actors in TV shows and films are creating dramatic scenes, they're not just sitting static at a table. They're moving around. They're using their arms. They're walking back. They're leaving the room. They're coming back into the room. So I think that LARP adds that extra dimension to drama in role playing, which I would love to kind of try and distill more into a tabletop experience, because I think it's really powerful.
And Emily Kerboss did an extrapolation the other way of the drama system rules into LARP, and that's quite brilliant if you're looking for some LARP rules. Now, the thing about the word drama is normally when you say, well, he created some drama, that's often not a good thing in real life.
Yeah.
And so I think we should talk also about the sort of emotional pitfalls of something where conflict can occur in any role-playing game, and also people introducing things into the storyline that others might not like so much is also part of the experience. At Gen Con, I did this panel. Kat was busy stuck behind the booth, so I recruited a group of younger designers, and they made sure that they spent a lot of time talking about consent, which is a big generational shift in role-playing, in that most of us are about the same age here at the Kraken, and we didn't think much about that, in part because we're all sort of culturally had a sort of, or at least we thought we did. Often, probably at the table, there were people who never came back again because something happened that they didn't like. consent, I have learned, is not just about not doing certain things, but I've discovered that a lot of the younger group really loves to dig into all of this drama, and they love to talk about consent in this context. So how would you go about dealing with drama at the table when you have a sort of a mixed generational group who have different assumptions?
I think that, like, like you said, like the younger generation are very much aware of safety tools in a way that our generation were not so much at the table. And one of the most common ones is called the X card, and it's quite straightforward. You just draw an X on a piece of paper and you put it down on the table. If anyone at any point in the game isn't comfortable with the content or with what's going on, they can just touch the X card and the whole party moves on from wherever they are in the drama. And there's no questions asked. You don't need to explain anything. You just say, nope, not having this. And you cut whatever you're doing and you move on to a different aspect of the game. And it's another thing that people are doing as well is, I know in one of our story games in Seven Wonders, we encourage people to make a list of topics that they don't want to see in the game. So as well as things from a kind of a potentially triggering or traumatic perspective, that can also be like if you've just come out of like a really heavy sci-fi campaign and you're like, I'm done with sci-fi, I just don't want to have any sci-fi in this game. You can add that to the list. So it covers any sort of topic that players might not want to be in the game. And I think that like, I know quite a few people in the kind of Nordic LARP culture, and one of the main things for them about consent tools is that when you are entirely 100% comfortable that you have gotten consent from your co-players, you can dive a lot deeper into the drama of that. So you can do things that we, I think, as tabletop gamers wouldn't necessarily dare to do in a tabletop game, because we'd just be like, well, I don't know if the person's into that. But once you've established that trust and you've established that consent, you both know that you can go heavier and harder into that drama because everyone's on board with it. Everyone's on the same page. You've created a culture and a game where everyone wants the same thing. And I think that for me is one of the most exciting things about safety tools, is just knowing that you have everyone's okay to be where you are in the game.
And the more emotional content your game has, or the more that you want to have players in particular engaging with each other, I think the more likely that's going to happen. That in a more procedural game where you have a mission, or you're just trying to fight the bad guys or discover the secret tape or whatever, there's some chance in any genre that material will creep in that people are not interested in. So it's not like you shouldn't use safety tools with anything, but you're much more likely to come up with something that reminds somebody in the group of their real life in a way that they don't necessarily want to engage with. I guess we should talk a bit about how to construct characters that are open to change and open to giving in. And the way a drama system does that is with dramatic polls. So do you want to talk a bit about dramatic polls?
Can I talk about the character relationship diagram instead?
Let's do that.
And have you talked about
Sure
dramatic
thing.
polls?
See, there we go. I made a petition. She modified the exchange a little, and we both came out happy. I'm not sure which of us got the drama token, but proceed. Because Robin talked earlier about kind of stealable tech, and I think that's one of the things that we always try to do in our game is have kind of elements that not only work within that game, but that are really easily stealable and puttable in other games. And one of the main things that I have stolen repeatedly from the drama system in other games that I've run is the character relationship map that you build at the start of the game. And Robin's kind of mentioned, how one person is the petitioner and one person is the grantor. And the way that you set it up is that you establish a relationship with the other characters, and you draw a line between two characters. You write everyone's name down on a piece of paper, and then you draw lines between each of the characters. And you decide what the person wants, as we did in the scene earlier. So, like, my character wants obedience from Robin's character. Robin's character is not going to give me obedience because I want breathing space from her.
He wants breathing space. So you kind of establish what each person wants from the other character, and a reason why the other character can't give that or won't give that concession to that person. And then, as Robin said, you create scenes to kind of explore that drama and to build out on that drama. But the character map gives you like a very clear, if you're not quite sure where to go next for a scene, you can always go back to that kind of physical character map and go, okay, so like I'm still trying to get that respect from your character, so let's try and dig deeper into that.
And the stealable aspect of that is that you can do that literally in any game that you run with procedural focus, or you can do a version of that. So, for example, in a fantasy game where you have the typical group of fantasy freebooters, it's like, why do you guys all hang out together? Why haven't you killed each other yet? So what I have done on some occasions is like a variation on that, where I say, talk about the character on your left. Tell me why you trust that person, or tell me why you care about that person, or tell me about the greatest sacrifice that person ever made for you. And so by quickly going around the table, you get to, to use a Kraken-friendly metaphor, the thing where it's the dragon newt and the minotaur and the Orlanthe windlord and the trickster and the Ernalda priestess all hanging out together. It's like, why do you guys even know each other, right? And you then suddenly very quickly go, oh, well, you've been through it together, and this is why this person needs to be with this person. This is why or what is your attitude toward the other person, and that can then sort of immediately create a cohesion in the group that makes everything that you're doing make sense, and hopefully you buy into that, not only as just sort of an explanation of what's going on, but that you play those out. And so Drama System has scenes in it where you're calling scenes, and often in my other game I will sort of covertly call a scene and sort of guide the players into a sort of an interaction. So I'll say, oh, well, you're all together in the cafe in 1895 Paris, you're different art students, and you had a rough night last night. You don't quite remember what happened, but you remember this sort of mask and a weird yellow robe, and this is the scene in the cafe in the morning where you're just going to talk about it and try and figure out what happened. And so that's scene framing, and there's lots of other games that do that too. So that's also something that you can be unafraid to do in the context of your own games, in order to encourage people not just to interact, but to interact in a particular way with a certain focus, so that they know what to do, right? It's a little version of giving them the mission, except the mission isn't, go and hit that guy in the head and take his treasure, but have a discussion about this, and then you can sort of guide that along. Yeah,
and I think that really kind of focuses on the player agency as well. Like, it's not the GM sitting there going, so today, here's what you're going to do, you were there last night, and you're going to now go and do this. And so it kind of really changes the focus from the GM, expositioning at people, to the players kind of more co-creatively getting into the
right
scene.
And because a lot of times in standard tabletop you have sort of a silo where each player is talking to the GM, but they don't talk to each other all that much, except specifically when they're planning something and shooting down each other's plans. And often, this is a tangent, but often shooting down the perfectly reasonable plans the GM was hoping that one of them would pick. To make your character open to being interacted with, it is often useful to think about their dramatic poles. And if you look at classic works of drama, the characters aren't just one thing, or they're not one way and then they end up completely the opposite at the end of the story, but rather they are torn in two directions, and the story is about the resolution of which of those people they wind up being. And so Hamlet, for example, is torn between action and contemplation. Walter White is he a milquetoast or is he a monster? Tony Soprano, is he a family man with a small f, or is he family man with a capital F? Is he a mafia don? And you can, one of the most common dramatic poles that we see again and again is between altruism and selfishness. So Rick Blaine in Casablanca, for example, or Han Solo is Rick Blaine in space, and that classic formula is, well, I'm jaded, I'm done with the world, I'm just going to be selfish from now on, and then oh no, here's an opportunity to be heroic. No, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to leave with the money. Oh no, I got to go back to the Death Star and save Luke. And so that is always one that works well in the context of an adventure. But there are a lot more too. Can you think of other cool? As I tricked you into talking about two radicals after all.
Yeah, how cunning. One that I was thinking about just as you were talking was kind of the duty, like over on one side, and I was trying to work out what your other, like duty versus selfishness.
Right.
So it's not so much like altruism, but like I'm thinking of more like familial duty.
Right.
You know, so where you have that kind of, and you know,
often it's freedom.
Yeah.
It's often duty versus freedom.
Versus freedom. Yeah, or like self-actualization, or that kind of being able to choose your own destiny versus having this obligation kind of thing. I think that's quite a common one in almost in kind of in historical, in more historical works, I think.
And often women characters, that's their journey from, it's often duty versus liberation.
Yeah.
So word about the halfway point, and this is a masterclass, so this is a point where we open it up to questions. So does anybody have a question about introducing more drama to your game? This is where we're making a petition to the audience to not be left hanging, sitting here on the...
I do have a question. How do you balance the drama between the players and the story of the campaign, whatever you're running itself? Because you have a story in mind, you have to run something, you have to arrive to a certain point, and if the drama, I'm thinking if you give them a tool to use drama, it will might turn just into a drama session after session, and how they interact between themselves.
Well, often if you think of, I think all of us have had the occasion playing a more traditional role-playing game of the night when nobody rolled a die, right? And you all go, that was great. We never rolled a die at all, and we just had this thing, and the story just flowed. And in a way, drama system is the way to make sure that happens again, because then the next week you show up and go, we never rolled a die again. The ostrich men are coming at you. Roll for initiative, and you never figure out how to get back there. So part of the balance, I think, is to look at how that is done in other entertainment forms that have both a procedural and a dramatic element. So, for example, Star Trek episodes after the original series, which is a much older style of writing, with there's sort of banter, but there's not a lot of big dramatic scenes. But since then, there's the mission, and then there's sort of subplots to the side. Often the actor who is not afforded much to do in the actual main mission gets his contractually obligated number of lines in. In Next Generation, I know someone who was asked to submit some spec scripts to Next Generation, and he was told the number, he had to pick two actors, and this actor got, I'm getting the numbers wrong, 72 lines. This actor has to get 48 lines, and all the other actors, here's the number of lines that they get.
Wow, is it really that scripted?
It's that organized,
or that
because everybody's agents have gotten in there, and
sure, okay.
And I think it depends from the obviously newer series that are more serialized. You don't have that sort of ongoing thing where it's now but at that point, obviously, there's some contractual obligations going on there, and I'm sure the actors all the actors who all supposedly really love each other in that show went back to their trailers and counted their lines. So one way to make that connect is to find a thematic element where the drama dovetails with the mission, so that it's not just contradicting the mission, but it furthers the mission. So if you ask your characters, for example, to specify dramatic poles, and someone specifies duty versus freedom, you come up with a plot. Well, you're going to have to go and talk to the pharaoh, who you have the main duty to, and he's going to ask you to do something that's going to sacrifice your freedom. What do you do? And so that the other players then have a stake for that. Probably the other players are going, agree with the pharaoh, we need it, the pharaoh's help. And you're like, I don't know what to do. And that gives them opportunities for their interaction to it's not one story at war with another story, but two stories that are dovetailing and supporting each other.
Yeah, and I think we talked a bit yesterday as well about kind of clues and about how you can kind of seed clues through, and that's really kind of picking up on the same thing. Like a lot of our games are in harmony, even though they're quite different systems. So I think definitely like making the kind of emotional subplot dovetail, as Robin said, with the main plot, but also like finding ways to bring that back around in a circle into the main plot as well. And like I'm kind of thinking of like we at a convention called Dragon Meet in London, every year all of the Pelgonistas get together, and we're a terrible group for just not looking at the plot at all. Like it's very hard to do a procedural game with us because we're all just cross table talking. That's all we do. We just banter in character all the time.
That's the one who mostly runs for them. That just makes it easier to put them in my trap.
It is.
I'm onto their ways.
Yeah, because it's quite, it's like very distracting. We're not paying attention.
There might be
to
some
what
wine at the table. Who
Robin's
knows?
doing. Also, we're drinking. Yeah. But no, I think that what people have done, what like GMs like Robin and when Ken's run games and Gareth as well, is that they've always given us that space to banter, and then kind of given us an amount of time, and then kind of gone, and now, the alien ant farmer attacking. And that kind of, so if you kind of cut into a really dramatic kind of, a dramatic in a different way, like an antagonist action dramatic, that can really focus the player's attention quite quickly, or like suddenly there's an explosion and you're like, oh, okay, right, never mind, we'll get back to that. Let's focus on the explosion. So,
as a sidebar, I hand it to Ken for giving you the impression he's ever run the game for us. No. Another question.
If you have a game with NPC sidekicks, which are tied to one character, how do you get them to get more into drama? Do you hand them over to other players temporarily, and how do you handle that?
That can be a really fun thing to play with because typically a sidekick is what in literary terms is called a foil. So that is a character who contrasts with the other character. Now sometimes in some genres the contrast is not great, right? Is that, Robin is just Batman with a goofier costume and he's shorter. But, he's just there to ping words off of. But, other great sidekick relationships are like Frodo and Sam, where Sam is the one who believes in Frodo even when Frodo stops believing in Frodo. And so I think it can be very fruitful to allow certain characters that you sort of jump around in and other people get to play as sort of ensemble characters the way they do in Ars Magica. So you wouldn't necessarily say that one person always plays, the warrior queen's shield maiden, but that whoever's there that night, once you sort of establish what her pattern is, and then you would just set up a dramatic relationship, because you normally think of sidekicks as just doing what you want, but in this case it'd be, well, sometimes it turns out the shield maiden is torn between duty and freedom. And thoughts on?
I was kind of thinking, like, kind of relating back to your question, I think you can also use them to shift the spotlight time around. Is it in Drama System that we have the spotlight tracker? Is that a thing from Drama System, or is that from
that must be
our
from
other
something
games?
else.
Okay, that must be from one of the Seven Wonders games. But yeah, so you can kind of also use them, you can build relationships with NPCs to, if one character is getting a lot of spotlight time because they have that relationship with a significant NPC, and it means that both the player's actions but also the character's actions and the NPC's actions are all putting spotlight on that one player, you can just build out a relationship with another character, and that can really kind of make sure that you're distributing the spotlight time equally, I think, to each player.
Yeah, so if you have someone who's sort of sitting back that night and doesn't, or they've gone off on this stupid side mission you didn't want them to go on, separated from the party for an hour, you can have them play the Shield Maiden. You mentioned Seven Wonders. You should talk more about that, because that's an awesome thing that all of these people should be familiar with.
I probably should do. Seven Wonders is a collection of 7 story games that we published 3 years ago now, I think. But a really interesting collection of very, very different kind of games that, like Drama System, are specifically focused on narrative and on intercharacter drama and intercharacter relationships. And the focus is really on those, but in different kind of settings. So they take quite traditional settings or quite traditional genres like fantasy, and then they kind of invert them or subvert them and do very different things with them. Like, for example, one of the games in it is a super traditional, there's a big epic war, it's a fantasy setting, big epic war, and all of the great heroes go off to battle, and they go to fight the battle, and that's great. But you're not playing the big heroes that go off to fight the battle. You're playing the people that are left behind in the village after all of those heroes have gone off, and during the game you write letters to the people you have relationships with, and so it's a much more kind of intimate, more kind of homely and kind of cozier take on the big fantasy battle in the big fantasy world kind of thing. So each of them are very, very different, but they all have a lot of different, like I was talking about the Spotlight Tracker, they all have very different mechanics in them. They're all standalone systems to build out the character drama, to build character relationships, and also to really focus the really kind of, we talk a lot in Pelgrane games about player agency, about enabling the players to have the kind of game that they want to have, rather than, again, it being a GM directive coming down from above and the GM saying, this is the kind of game we're going to play. So it gives the players and the GM and the group as a whole a lot of tools to build play together, rather than having it come down from above from the GM.
And Lynn has a piece in that.
Lynn
right?
has, yeah. You're not Lynn, obviously. But,
He's Lynn's foil.
but yes, Kraken special guest and all-round fantastic egg, Lynn Hardy, wrote one of the games in it, which is a really lovely one called Small Things. And you play these little creatures in a very kind of traditional English country house. It's very kind of 50s, kind of, again, very homely and lovely. And you play the creatures that take care of the house, in the background. So you fight against like dust and like rain coming in through the wood, and all of the kind of like invisible threats that your family, the family that live in the house, don't know about. So you're like secretly protecting them from around the corners. It's a very, very lovely game.
Another question?
Well, I was thinking that all this inter-character or inter-player drama, it might be feel difficult to some people. So have you had a situation in which you have a player who is maybe shy, or maybe a new player, or new to role-playing games, or maybe he's just used more to rolling dice, and how could you encourage and bring him to this dramatic relationships and action?
So I think a good tool is to, if you know you have people in your group who are already good at it, let them do it first, right? So we started with a demonstration today, and let your players who are most adept at that demonstrate it, and maybe even then say, break it down and say, so you see how that went, there was resistance, and then the negotiation changed, and they did this. And so, and then start out by giving them a sort of a kind of a gentle introduction into talking to the person. So, and kind of talk them through it and give a bit narration the way a film director maybe would in an old-timey movie where that's a silent film and they tell them what to do. So it's like, okay, you're going to go and talk to the silversmith, and you all know that you suspect that he's involved with the contraband smuggling, and he's probably not going to want to talk to anybody else in the group, but you, of course, are a devotee of the god of silver, so he's going to be receptive to you. So even though ordinarily you wouldn't be the one to go and do the talking, you've got this reason to do it. So you've already set up why the loquacious player who's champing at the bit to go in and talk to the person has a reason not to do it, and why they get to go in and do it. And you've also created maybe a low stakes situation where they're not going to be humiliated or attacked, or sometimes players are happier to be attacked than to have to talk to somebody. But give them a gentle sort of a way in, and kind of encourage them, rather than, if you know someone is shy, don't drop them in, and don't leave them hanging in the middle of a scene, cut it quickly short so that they can, start to pick it up at their own pace. And it may be that some casual players or players who are interested in tactics or whatever are perfectly content not to engage in drama in a mixed game, but rather give them something else to do. Often at general gaming advice panels, which I've been doing for years and are the origin of my book, Robin's Laws of Good Game Mastering, there are some typical questions you always get. And one of them is, how do I get my players to engage more in role-playing? Which the thesis of the book says, maybe your players aren't all interested in that part of role-playing, and you should be aware of that and let them do what they want, and let the ones who want to do the role-playing do it. But that's the answer to the question, if you're thinking maybe they are and just don't know how to get there.
Yeah, because I think there's, like, for me, I'm kind of hearing almost two different kind of types of player there. So like you've got your kind of really shy player who's just not very comfortable kind of talking in front of the group, or isn't very comfortable with, like I use the term spotlight a lot, which is like when one player is kind of interacting with the GM and when people's attention is on them. And so I think that there's a difference between having a player who's just not comfortable with that kind of spotlight and that kind of attention. But also there's an issue with a player who might be comfortable with that kind of attention, but isn't comfortable with conflict. So, particularly in drama system, what you want is for the characters to be butting heads. You want for them to be conflicted, you want there to be a push and a pull, and, for them to be disagreeing, which isn't always a comfortable thing, I think, for a lot of players. So, again, following on from what Robin said, like easing people in gently to either one, I think, is the best way of going about it. As a GM, he'll focus a GM'd game, so certainly I think I would at the start be like, rather than having them in scenes with other players, unless they have a particularly close relationship to one of the other players, I would focus more on having scenes with the GM where you're more able to control and direct, and like Robin said, like cut the scene early and make sure that you're giving a lot of kind of emotional support to that player to kind of to bring them into that. Another thing that I think you could try and do is, like, everyone has their favorite media, so everyone has like their favorite TV show or their favorite film or whatever. So you can always use that as an example of how characters interact. So like go to what their favorite media is, like go to their favorite TV show and go, well, on Star Trek, right, when you've got these two characters, like when Picard is trying to teach Data how to be more human or whatever. And this is how that plays out, and you can kind of, encourage them to kind of analyze more and to look more at how that dynamic plays through, and use that then as a model for their own action and for their own play, and kind of take inspiration from how characters on their favorite media work through things. So just because that kind of validates what you're doing, it gives it authority, and it kind of says this is an okay thing for you to do because you've seen people do this in other media. But it also gives them examples of how that interplay works and makes them more comfortable with replicating that, because they're not creating the problems themselves, or they're not hogging the attention themselves. They're just doing the same thing as they've seen in other media.
During the investigative panel, we talked about a technique called as a seasoned investigator, which is where you just break the fourth wall a bit and say, explain something that the character would perceive given the situation that the player doesn't necessarily perceive, because they're not in a fantasy world talking to the silversmith, they're sitting around a table eating Doritos. So you can also do that in terms of giving them the perceptions of the person they're talking with, and it's a little invasive. Strict immersionists may object to that, but I think most strict immersionists that's sort of less of a thing these days, isn't it? People are more willing to play with the boundaries.
With the fourth wall,
and you can just say, well, as you're talking to him, you notice that when you said that one thing, he kind of twitched a bit. That's not even really breaking the fourth wall, that particular one. Yeah. Or you just get a sense that he's got something else going on and is trying to get somewhere. And so neither of those is hugely invasive, but there are also little cues. It's like, oh wait, if he has to be somewhere and I start annoying him and wasting his time, maybe he'll give up and give me what I want, or what have you. So you can throw in little cues to sort of suggest
how the player might want to play it.
How he can, because in the theater work that inspires drama system, actors will break down a text and for each little beat, sub-moment of the text, and often one line of dialogue can have 2 or 3 beats in it, they figure out what their tactic is, and that is how exactly are they approaching the other person. For example, in the scene we played, stepmom started with the sort of call to authority, which is a standard tactic. I have authority over you. And then when that didn't work, there was a bit more negotiation. And then there was the kid who thought he was clever foolishly gave stepmom an opportunity to establish an emotional empathy with him. And then after that, he was totally screwed. And so you saw both characters shift tactics throughout that. And so you can always sort of call in a way that encourages new players who are not so familiar with it to kind of hint them toward one particular tactic or another to help them succeed in the scene. Because sometimes you can kind of get stumped when you're kind of butting up against each other and you run into that.
Yeah. Oh no, I was doing that kind of nodding and agreeing with you thing. But yeah, like Robin said, you can kind of go, oh well, she seems to be quite intimidated by you, so maybe if you go in hard, kind of encourage them to act in the way that will get them what they want.
Another question.
Yay.
You're starting with the paladin and the thief, who have this obvious conflict on how to act. I often have the opposite problem. The characters are always agreeing. So how can I introduce conflict?
Right. Well, it's actually easier to introduce conflict than it is to
resolve it.
Yeah. So you give them a different stake in a situation, right? A different outcome that they want. So you are and the classic way in a mission-focused scenario say, well, everybody thinks they're going to talk to the pointy-headed prince in order to get him to agree to the peace treaty, but classically, actually, you want to convince him to, well, the obvious thing is kill him, so let's make that a little more interesting. Your job is to convince him to abdicate in favor of his much more clever and efficient younger sister. And so that gives them a reason to be at odds with one another. A more artificial way of doing that is if everybody's too agreeable and you want more drama, sort of do a time jump and say, well, you've been trapped in the city of Karst together, you foolishly won this battle, you've been, and then as a result of that, you became the rulers of the city and you divided up responsibilities for different parts of rulership of the city. You each had your portfolios, and it's been a year later and you've all realized that you all are at odds with each other and you have different, and you've come to kind of be irritated with each other and the band has sort of fallen apart. So, and then go around the table. So why did he annoy the snot out of you? What did she do to really burn a bridge with you? And why are you mad at her? So it's sort of the opposite problem you can solve in the opposite way, right?
Yeah.
Is there another question?
Having a system that sort of creates a mechanic for drama or puts in a mechanic for drama, doesn't, perhaps I don't know, I'm just thinking aloud, doesn't it create a situation for an abuse by the players, by crafty players to say, okay, I introduce this drama which I do so that I get tokens, so that when I want something really to be done, I can use my tokens. I don't know, I'm just thinking.
That's not abuse of the system, that is the system. That's what it deliberately sets out to encourage.
Okay, so you're creating abuse, you're creating drama all the time, which you would lose, so that you get tokens.
Exactly, yes. My group does that all the time. And those are the to use a technical term, funnest scenes. One of my players, Rachel, who's also one of our illustrators, she her favorite tactic is to storm out of a scene at the end, and she's so if someone comes to her with something that she wants to do, she's disappointed because she wants to raise a fuss and put up all sorts of defenses and then storm out of the room at the end, and so her characters are always very tough on everybody else and hard to come to, she tends to sort of burrow down in a defensive position in the emotional framework of the group, and people forces them to come to her. Ken?
There was Jonathan Tweet had a selection of cards called Whimsy cards, and I happen to remember a particular one, Dramatic Reversal. And the way the Whimsy cards were is that each player would draw at random 2 of these cards, and when something was going on, then the other players would be able occasionally to intervene to either ratchet up the conflict or to soothe things. And one of the things that felt good about that is it was a invitation for you to present. In other words, it was telling you what the scene, how the scene had changed. And because it was a repeating activity that you came to delight in that reversal. In other words, whenever somebody played reversal or crisis of faith, or whatever is something like that, that people began to identify those reversals as familiar and delicious moments to savor. So part of it is making those, I'd love to see, by the way, the tragedy is I think you probably find them free downloadable, just for your own references. But the thing is, I found that it was a dead end commercially, and I never saw it work more.
Well, it was an unsuccessful product insofar as cards written on cardstock with a laser printer could be unsuccessful. And it was actually Jonathan Tweet and Mark Reinhagen did those together. And in fact, they were involved in Alarms and Excursions at the time that I was. And so I once got a letter saying, "I'm Jonathan Tweet. I'm Mark Reinhagen. We're putting together these things called Whimsy cards, and we'd like to play in your play-by-mail campaign." And that's how Mark didn't follow through, but that's how I ended up working with Jonathan a bunch. Those were actually very groundbreaking at the time, because that was very early on in the tradition of being able to
play your character,
to give meta-narrative control to players so that they could break the fourth wall and introduce things into the story back at a time when it was like, the GM has this job, the players have this job, you can't mess with those boundaries at all, and that, those cards in general really threw things
But they
cockpit.
also gave other players, as opposed to the games master, the responsibility for the flow.
Exactly.
And the fact that it's like with Dungeons and Dragons, whenever there was a crisis, you always looked at your character sheet. You always look at the objects or the props that you had for your characters. And if you also have dramatic cards that you can play as your props, then you think of the class of dramatic outcomes, and you begin to exteriorize them into, in other words, you recognize that it is a domain of activity that you probably enjoy, and also you can be helpful to a games master, or you can make things worse, which is always, as you were worrying about, if you give other players an opportunity to make other things worse.
Well, that is actually also something that's covered by the drama token economy, in that you can spend your drama tokens to, like, if 2 players are having a scene and they're all like, "Oh, will you make a concession to me?" And the other one's like, "Oh, I don't know, maybe I might." And they're like, "Oh, but will you?" "Oh, I might." And you're like, "Oh, God damn it, will you just do a thing?" You can spend drama tokens to, like, have your character turn up and be like, "Right, now, let's get some drama."
Yeah, you can jump into a scene, which is often a exciting bone of contention. And I think what all of these things we're talking about in this hour have in common is that they encourage people to think about, as players, that it's their job to contribute entertainment and conflict. And I think now everyone in the audience now has a petition they would like to make of you and I, Kat, which is to shut the F up so we can have lunch. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming and asking all your great questions.